Thank you, Charlie, for that wonderful introduction that you've just given us. And I want to thank you and also Physique at this time for inviting us today to speak a little bit about what a elite pre-professional dancer and the physical development of that dancer looks like in an institution such as the Royal Ballet School. And we can hopefully share a little bit of context to some of the healthcare development work that is going on inside the school to some wider audiences, which is great. I'm Wayne Kitchener. I'm a physiotherapist that's worked at the school for 4 years, and I'm currently acting up into a role where I've got more management responsibility as part of that. And I'll be talking a little bit to start about the context and the overall landscape of the school in a little bit more detail. And we've got 3 for the price of 1 tonight, whereby we've got Niall MacSweeney, who is the strength and conditioning coach at White Lodge, which, as you'll go on to see, is the lower end of the school where they with the children that are aged between 11 to 16 attend. And then we've also got Matthew Lamarque, who is the strength and conditioning coach at the upper school, who will be giving us a little bit more detail about what that transition phase then looks like onto them becoming a professional dancer. So to give you all a little bit of insight into what our context looks like, I've just got a short video that I want you to see to start with, that just gives an idea about what the healthcare department is about, but also how it integrates nicely with their artistic performance. Excellent. So I hope you all enjoyed watching that, and that gives you a little bit of a flavour and understanding about what some of the students do on an artistic level, in terms of some of that work was coming from some of the summer shows that they perform in the summertime. And obviously, hopefully it gives you some understanding about how some of the healthcare work links in together. Now, I'm just going to show you a slide a little bit to explore what our healthcare team looks like and some of the changes that have gone on over the last couple of years. There was a significant uplift in healthcare at the school back in 2016, because there's been a lot of companies that have invested heavily into healthcare environments with great success, and the school at the time has invested in some healthcare, but it wasn't a full and holistic, complete team that was all working in one unit together. So due to some kind sponsorship of the Healthy Dancer program, the school was able to expand across both of its sites. And I'll talk a little bit about the sites later on, but we've got White Lodge and Upper School, and there's a healthcare manager that oversees the whole of the healthcare program and manages the whole healthcare team. We've got 2 physiotherapists that sit over across the 2 sites. We've got 1 full-time strength and conditioning coach across both sites, both of which have active involvement in research in their particular interests and field that they'll talk about a little bit later on. We have 2 Pilates instructors at the upper school that combine to make 0.8 of a full-time post, and we have 1 Pilates instructor at White Lodge. We importantly have this very unique and specific role known as rehab ballet at the school, which really looks to address in that classic model of an injured athlete or an injured dancer, where you've got an individual that often will need a diagnosis and then a key assessment management plan, and then some level of return to dance. There is often that phase between a really thorough physiotherapy and strength and conditioning review and program, that then that return to their particular skill is often one of the areas that can be most challenging for people to sort of get that sort of key return skills. And what the rehab ballet instructor does is that it's a nice mix between an individual with some background in rehabilitation science, but that's also then combined with the artistic knowledge of being a ballet teacher, that can then link together some of the really critical work that we do in the other disciplines to then get that really effective transition through back to full dance again. As you can imagine, we have nutrition as part of our service due to some of the challenges and difficulties that we have around managing energy deficiency in some of our dancers. We've got an emotional health service that comprises of counselling and a clinical psychologist. And obviously then we have the relevant medical support that's on site as well, to be able to then underpin the whole team. And so part of the roles, as we know, is often about returning a dancer back to being fully dancing again. But also there's this service is there to be able to support the artistic team as much as they can, to be able to look at what individual aspects of performance would be required to then hit certain artistic elements of the ballet. And so, as with any high performing service, there is that injury management side of things, but then there's also those questions around how do we optimally get our artists to perform and develop them to become the best performers that they can be. So a little bit more about the context of the school is the aim of the school is to be the leading classical ballet school in the world. And overall, across 2 sites, which I'll talk about in a second, we take about 220 students, which obviously varies slightly year on year. Like I said before, you've got the context is that you tend to get about 135 11 to 15-year-olds that are based in White Lodge. And if anyone's ever been to White Lodge, it's the hunting lodge that's based in Richmond Park. And they come at the age of 11, and this they are allowed not to board, but ideally it is a full boarding school. And they do a combination of both academic and obviously artistic training, all the way from ages 11 through to 15 and through their GCSE years. If they've again got the ability to be able to progress through, then we've then got the upper school, which is based in Covent Garden, and I'll show you a picture of it later, which is next to the Royal Opera House. And that takes about 85 students per year, 85 students total at the school, spread across 3 years, between 16 and 19, as you can see. And the difference is that in a classic school, you would see that you'd have a year 12 and year 13 year group. But then we also have a year 14 year group, which is also known as our 3rd year. And in this year, the focus is almost a bit like an apprenticeship year, where they tend to get exposure to different job environments, to different places where they can practice ballet, different companies. And also they're then focusing on their audition process in order to be able to look for the relevant work. As you can imagine, there's a high degree of training. So we operate as per a standard school year, where we get 37 weeks of training over a 45-week academic year. 4.5 hours per day is often related to some sort of dance-related activity. And what I'll show you now is that you can roughly see what a rough day looks like for a 3rd year, whereby they start with academics in the morning, and then they progress through to a ballet class as their first class of the day. And then a variation would often be that they work on a particular solo. So that's often a single shortened piece of ballet whereby they'd be playing a particular role in a ballet performance that they would then do. And then pas de deux is basically the part of the ballet, the part of ballet vocabulary that looks at the male and the female dancer dancing together. You might have seen some of that if you've watched some ballet before. They can have somewhere between 3 but up to 7 hours of ballet and dance related activity during a rehearsal and show period, which is obviously extra, and we combine this alongside the relevant supplementary training, which you'll hear a little bit about later when Matt and Niall give us a bit of an overview of that. As you can imagine, it's predominantly a very early specialization environment in terms of our environment. However, we do sometimes get dancers that come from other environments and other backgrounds. Gymnastics is often quite a popular one, where you can get some transition over. But as you can imagine, with the age that they're starting out, that there's a high degree of specialization in their training, which obviously comes to some challenges sometimes when it comes to growth, maturation, physical development, but also injury issues as well. Broadly speaking, we're looking at sort of 3 critical areas in terms of their work or their sort of development at the school. That being, academic achievement is still, like any school environment, highly sought after. Obviously, specifically ballet achievement, if it wasn't an elite ballet school environment and they weren't achieving at ballet, that would obviously be a bit of an issue. And obviously it's that overall adolescent development phase where they're obviously building that social, ethical, moral and character development skills that is all part of coming through adolescence. And we try to then, as a team, address and support all those issues with the students as best as we can. So a little bit more there about, there are 3 distinctive training groups that you can sort of pull out, which is this idea of, first of all, that where they're at White Lodge, through those years, they're training to train. So effectively, they're trying to learn the basic fundamental skills that it takes to become a pre-professional ballet dancer at that stage. When they move towards the upper school, they are tending to move more, or in the later part, of White Lodge, and obviously before they then move to upper school, and just in that phase, they're obviously then beginning to train more to rehearse. And this includes the concept of developing and learning a set of specific repertoire. And a repertoire would be an example of, if there was a particular act or particular dance in a ballet, then they might have to learn that rep, for example, to then be able to perform it at a relevant school performance. And obviously, when they then get into the later part of their upper school training, they're looking more at the finessing of their technique, but they're trying to then look at rehearsing to perform. To actually, the key skill, as you can imagine, of trying to train someone to be a professional dancer is then to be fully prepared on multiple levels, but specifically, they need to be prepared to perform. And that's what we try to aim to achieve with the dancers at the school. All this is based on people's chronological age, but obviously there is flexibility given towards maturation differences and technical ability. And finally, we tend to be the feeder school to lots of the Royal companies. So often a number of our students will go, after they finish their 3rd year training, to work at the Royal Opera House, at the Royal Ballet, but also the Birmingham Royal Ballet often takes a number of our students every year into their environment. And so I want to show you this, because the ultimate goal of the school on a ballet level is to ask the question to know whether this is the student an employable student, to be able to go into this professional ballet environment and be able to be working at a classical ballet company. If you've ever been to Covent Garden, you'll notice that there is this bridge of aspiration, is what it's called. And this bridge connects, and this is a really prominent thing that the students look up to, where there's this bridge that connects between the school and the company. And they'll often use this bridge when doing performances, to travel over or to go get lunch, etc., because they can often share the canteen at the Opera House. And so it was built there to obviously be that cultural standpoint and significance, to look at the pathway of moving across as a student at the school all the way through to a professional dancer. the biggest difference, I think, from my experiences of a traditional school is obviously tends to prepare people for whatever aspects in life that they might be setting up for, whether that be university, apprenticeships, etc. And when you then think to more the academy systems that train different athletes, for example, rugby and football, we often know that there's quite a very small percentage of people that go on and then successfully work in that particular profession. I suppose the biggest difference for me in ballet is that we tend to get a very high rate of people transitioning through into the professional career. So when they leave the school, the number of people that go on to then get professional contracts either at the companies I've mentioned or around the world tends to be well over 90%. So in terms of what we have got to consider in terms of training these young people and developing these young people is often very specifically towards trying to get them to that professional level as best we can. And one of the key aspects of feedback that we look at is to often ask some of the companies, when we're looking at the behaviors, the character, how they're managing their injuries, how they manage their load, all those sort of key behavioral characteristics that you would associate with a high performing person. We're often trying to get feedback from the companies that as a school, we're doing a good job in able to prepare them well for what's ahead in their careers. So as with any pioneering or as with any team, there's a critical set of values that are very important. And when we came into being a healthcare team, it was very important to us that there was a key that we, if you like, in the school's values, that there was a mention or an integration of healthcare into that environment. So our particular school value in terms of healthcare is to be pioneering, to be at the forefront of the physical and the mental health provision for these pre-professional dancers to create this stronger, happier, and more resilient group. And effectively, like I said, is that we're trying to think about these three critical pillars in all of our dancers' development. So we're trying to think about, first of all, achievement. So that can be in the sense of either academic or their ballet achievement, but we're also looking at developing their personal, their social, and their moral skills. So therefore, really focusing on the type of character that we develop as a dancer. And then finally, a lot where we sort of are integrating into all of those, but we're obviously therefore really focused on the physical, the mental, and the social health of these dancers to be able to best prepare them for the future. There are some challenges particularly more so now than maybe there has been before, in terms of the demands of ballet have changed between previous years and now. And I'm just going to briefly show you some work that looks at this was done mostly off of a visual piece of looking at the angles or the lines that dancers create. So you'll see that you might not understand some of these terminologies, but there's basically the words arabesque penché, développé à la seconde, and arabesque en pointe effectively are different movements and lines created in the ballet art form. And what they've done is they've looked at different pieces from different artists through time, and they've only done this through visualization, but they've looked at just measuring the angle through reviewing some of the videos of these dancers. And you can hopefully see that through time, and we're talking several decades here, the amount of flexibility or the required line, if you like, has changed. And it has become effectively slightly more extreme in terms of the angles that they are then needing to provide. And this obviously provides us with a very challenging case in terms of as a performance team, because we've got to try and look after their bodies as best we can. But ultimately, we've got to try and physically prepare them into a way that means that they can still deliver the requirements of what the future of ballet has looked like. And this lends itself nicely onto some of the other part of obviously that learning is that if you've read any adolescent neuroscience, you would be comfortable that in the younger age group, especially in adolescence, the development of the prefrontal cortex is not particularly well developed until very much into the early to mid 20s. And one of the things that the prefrontal cortex is really important in is to understand about future and to understand about risk. And a lot of the dancers often will very much try to produce, like I've shown in the previous slides, a very good looking line, good looking performance. But one of the really critical educational things that we have to inform them of is that as dancers age and change, is that will naturally, some of those lines will naturally change with age. And often we really need to focus about, it's one thing to be able to create the beauty and the artistry, but the other really important factor is about how we can then teach them to protect their bodies technically, to be as technically efficient as possible, and to be as physically prepared as possible with as least amount of injury, to be able to then keep a long career. And now we're seeing dancers that are able to do this well into their early, middle, late 40s, that are still then dancing as in principal roles on stage. Just the diagram or the pictures that I've put up on the board here are there just to demonstrate that from a colleague in America that's done some work that's looked at dancers longitudinally through time. These aren't our dancers, but it's done from some work over in the States. And they've looked at them longitudinally, and they've seen that at age 21, this is what an arabesque would look like. This is the movement. And you can see that there's the fish movement of the foot, which is that the foot is everted in the bottom photo. And you can see the angle created with their lumbar spine and hip there. And as you can see, as that dancer's then progressed through age, that line has naturally changed. And that is because of obviously the impact and the effects of natural aging with dance. But it's really critical that to protect their bodies, that we've given them this significant education and in this development phase. Finally, before I hand over to Matt and Niall, I just want to leave you with one last bit of context, which is that just to signify the importance of their training and their development and the education that we give them, is that this is, if you're again not familiar to ballet, you've got several roles or ranks in a ballet company, and this is data taken from the 2019-2020 cohort at the Royal Opera House or the Royal Ballet. And you can see, and that goes through rank order. And this is a representation of the female and the male dancers that are in the company. And if I then show you in this first section here, this is a total of 99 dancers. And over 80% of those dancers had at least between 1 and 3 years training at the Royal Ballet School. And then if I then show you after that 35% of these dancers travelled or their careers at the Royal Ballet started all the way from age 11 through the whole way of White Lodge. And I just wanted to leave you with that to signify that there is the pathway really does promote these dancers to move towards professional dancers at the Royal Ballet. And so therefore, effectively, what we are doing with these young children is really trying as best as we can to prepare them for their futures as professional dancers. And that, I suppose, is what's very unique about the Royal Ballet School. I'm now just going to hand you over to Niall, that's going to talk to you a little bit more about the context and the environment of White Lodge and the lower school, and he'll be able to then sort of expand on a few of those issues particular to that age group. So over to you, Niall.
Thanks, Wayne. Thanks for the introduction. So yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about White Lodge, which is the school for the younger dancers, which is where I am the kind of sports scientist or strength and conditioning coach. As I say, White Lodge has dancers from the ages of 11 to 16. We have a little bit less dancing, so we tend to do between 3 or 4 hours of dancing a day and 4 hours of academics. The students prepare for their GCSEs as well as their obviously balletic assessments. Most of the children live at the school, and there's approximately 140 students with roughly a 50-50 split of girls and boys. We have students, kind of the majority are probably British, but we also have students from all over the world. It's kind of an amazing building. It's in Richmond Park. But obviously there are some constraints in terms of what you can and can't do in there, in terms of facilities. So that's kind of the environment in which we're working in. So in terms of goal setting, as Wayne talked about, I guess there's more of a focus on training to train, but and developing the dancers for a kind of long and healthy career. It's obviously competitive to stay in the school, and one of the main aims is to get to the next school, is to get to Wayne's school. So yeah, so the first way we want to enable the dancers to do this is by hopefully reducing the injury risk, and thus keeping the dancers dancing freely, unrestricted in class for longer, which allows them to practice more and hopefully become better through that. And there's also, we want to identify kind of performance measures, specific things that relate to ballet, and improve the physical qualities that underpin those measures. As obviously the dancers are growing and still developing some of these aspects. And hopefully a combination of this allows the dancers to be physically prepared and have more time training, and allows them to perform at their best. And hopefully we get more of the students progressing through towards upper school, but also some of the students might choose a different path, but we just want to enable them to achieve whatever their ambitions are, either within dance or out dance. There's also contextual goals, and I imagine this is quite similar to what you're used to in terms of a youth development environment. So there's a heavy kind of education component to it, as in terms of, obviously it's an actual school within itself, but we're also trying to teach them how to live kind of healthier lifestyles. We teach them about nutrition, psychology, everything like that, and we've got a really good team in place to do that. And also from my perspective, we also want to develop a kind of physical literacy. Okay, so we want to have all dancers able to train, you know, at any level, using a wide variety of things depending on their goals. And because of that, we need to develop the skills to perform the technique, and then the skills to perform that kind of under duress, I guess. So that's something that we also try and work on throughout the school, alongside the more specific demands to each individual. So if we look at our context, as Wayne talked about, we have probably quite a similar schedule in terms of the main kind of things around the year. In terms of, we have assessments and auditions, and the end of year shows, which are very big, but then we also have various different shows. So this would be like a year 11's timetable. But our daily timetable is quite different, okay? So it's a little bit more packed, I suppose, because the students have more academic work, but they do a little bit less dancing. And I suppose it's quite kind of varied in that sense. There's also probably a little bit more of a variety in terms of, you know, students that do music lessons and all this type of stuff, and just getting the students through. They're obviously a lot more supervised during this time by the various staff at the school, and they have kind of more homework demands and things like that. So it's a pretty jam-packed schedule. So it's all about, where do you fit in the S&C, and how do you do it in an efficient way that brings the best for each student, but also develops the kind of all the students to have that kind of physical competency, I suppose. So if we think about the individualizing the programs for the first aspect, so we're going to talk about the performance enhancement element of our programs, rather than the kind of injury prevention stuff, as I'm sure there's a lot of other talks on that. So, and this is a little bit more unique. So, as we say, we want to kind of target performance improvements through physical development, finding the things that underpin certain skills, and then trying to work out how to maximize that for each student. The skills that they need to work on is guided by the teachers and the conversation with the artistic staff, but is also guided by conversations with the students themselves. So they have some ownership of their own program. And then there's also consultation amongst the multidisciplinary team. So as Wayne talks about, we're quite lucky in that we've got a large variety of different practitioners, and all of them have kind of different specialities. So we can kind of target something from various different angles. So what we're going to talk about today is turnout. Again, I wanted to choose something that's a little bit more unique to ballet, and maybe people were less familiar with, to just provide a bit of an insight. So turnout is this kind of movement, I guess. It's really important within ballet to have your hips externally rotated through a wide variety of positions. And it's certainly something that's kind of technically something that the dancers need to be able to achieve, and is often fed back from either the students or the staff. So how would we do this for an individual? So we'd start by asking some initial questions. You know, in what sense do you feel that we need to improve their turnout during different types of movements? Or is it a kind of fatigue element? And then the basic test, which we will do as part of our screening, is how does their hip external rotation range of motion compare to the cohort, the kind of passive range of motion. If it's limited, obviously we're going to go down a kind of more flexibility intervention. If it's sufficient, then it's more likely to be a kind of strength type thing. We're then trying to identify where might the strength deficit be that's influencing the turnout. And again, yeah, just get a bit more specific into what elements of the dancer need work to improve that aspect of things. We've got some really great practitioners to identify things like that in terms of Pilates instructors and physios with a lot of experience within dance itself. This is the kind of first time I've put this in this, but this does feature a lot, as how old the dancers are obviously affects the different types of interventions that we can put in, and also what might be effective depending on how their body is developing at that time. So again, once we've done that, we also have some more questions in terms of the specific dancer that might influence the techniques that we use, for example, hypermobility or age, as I just talked about. And then we'll have a kind of range of different techniques that we can use depending on what we think is the limitation in that dancer's turnout. And also depending on what age they are, we might use different modalities. So they might vary in intensity, or we might use more active things, for example, for older dancers, whereas it could be a more kind of passive flexibility is needed for maybe some of the younger dancers. Of course, after that, we'll just review the changes and then go back and see if there's anything else we need to do. So if I take you back to our contextual goals, that might be an example of kind of identifying one performance component for each dancer. So it's important that each dancer understands how to, each dancer has their own program so that we maximize kind of getting the best out of them, but also we need a kind of more general approach. So one of the main challenges is how do we keep a kind of more general physical development program that's consistent enough to kind of layer on this proficiency and expertise and kind of overall kind of general capacity, whilst still doing this kind of individual stuff that is aimed at improving the dancer at a very specific time frame. So we've done that by developing a kind of periodization model. This would be similar to a long-term athletic development model, but obviously we call it long-term dancer development. And as part of this, we've developed an exercise categorization system. Broadly speaking, we'll have fundamental movement skills, such as we have jumping, balance, and trunk control. Force development exercises, which would be your traditional kind of S&C type exercises, such as squats, deadlifts, Olympic lifting, anything like that. And then we have isolated development exercises. So they're any exercise that focuses on specific joint or specific muscle groups, such as ankle strengthening or hip mobility, anything like that. That would be an isolated development exercise. Within that, each of those categories, for example, squatting, there has different levels of intensity. So we have level 1, which it would be a kind of body weight, more technique focused thing, as you can see here on the left with some of our year 7s. And then as it progresses up, level 2, there's still a technique component to it, but we are starting to add load. So it might be like a goblet squat or a overhead squat or something like that with relatively light weights. And then level 3 is our kind of more heavy duty lifting, where we're kind of really trying to hit those higher intensities. And as you can see here, we've got a clip of one of the students doing some kind of pretty traditional back squats. Within that, we can then aim to hit a certain number of kind of repetitions or a certain number of practice for each year group. So we can set out wider aims. So we might say, for example, this year 7 group has more fundamental movement skills and slightly less of the isolated stuff and the force development exercises. Whereas year 11, they might do a bit more of the force development exercises as they've kind of developed a bit more on the fundamental movement skills. With that in mind, within that would all be broken down again. So for example, as we talked about the fundamental movement skills, we might have a certain amount of balance work, a certain amount of jumping and landing, and we might have a certain amount of trunk work within that kind of amount that we're doing for that year group. This is all calculated by the total number of repetitions that someone does in each exercise, rather than considering the load, for obvious reasons, because the exercises don't translate that well. The other thing that's worth pointing out is, although I'm talking about this from a strength and conditioning perspective, all of our physical development work is categorized in this way. So it might be, for example, I do a very basic jumping and landing technique, a depth landing or something like that. Whereas a Pilates instructor might use the reformer and do some basic kind of footwork and landing mechanics in a kind of slightly more balletic context through that. And that might be both a kind of level 1, if it's double leg, it would be a level 1 landing skill, but obviously it's administered very differently, but it allows us to spread the work between practitioners and still work towards a more common goal. Within this group, we might also have 2 students that do things slightly differently. So these are an example of 2 year 11 students. I've used an example just focusing on the type of exercise we might use for turnout. So this student at the top here has spent more work on mobility, because we think that is probably more of an area that they need to improve to work on their turnout. Whereas this one has spent more time on kind of trunk and hip strength, okay, which is it's a different element that could improve your turnout. So even though both of these dancers might want to be improving their turnout, we can individualize it so they're doing it differently. But when we add all of the repetitions across all of the year group, we're still aiming for a kind of more common picture. And we also don't neglect anything for any student. So as you can see, the students are still doing both hip mobility and trunk strength. It might just be weighted slightly differently for different students. So one of the things that I'm sure those of you who are more familiar with this type of work might be familiar with is maturation, and how that can influence both performance and injury risk in our dancers. And that's something we've spent a lot of time looking at when we're at the school. This is very important for dancers because the technique is the kind of main performance outcome. So understanding how this might influence technique is crucial. So the first stage that people tend to focus on is our peak height velocity. That's when people grow in stature or grow in height, and that's probably what most people remember as their growth spurt. This can influence injury risk, as it might lead to some adolescent awkwardness as you lose a bit of coordination as you grow. It could also lead to a decrease in flexibility as you imagine the bone grows and the muscles attaching it don't grow at the same rate, so they grow after the bone, so there's a kind of tightness there that develops. And then also partly related to that might lead to a kind of increase in apophyseal injury risk, which is where the tendons attach into the growth plates on these students. And common injuries such as Osgood-Schlatters, which people might be familiar with, might occur generally around peak height velocity. And this is the type of overuse injury that can be very restrictive for our dancers and quite detrimental. There's also peak weight velocity. So that happens approximately a year after. And that has its own difficulties. So there's a change in body shape as the student or individual gets a more kind of adult body shape, and that's quite different for boys and girls. You might have some lower strength levels, particularly in the girls, where their kind of body weight has obviously changed, but their strength hasn't necessarily changed at the same rate. So that might influence things like jumping, for example. And there also might be an increase in kind of bone stress injury risk around this time. So one of the ways in which our bones develop their kind of bone density is by the impact that the muscles have when they're kind of pulling on the bones. But obviously the muscles grow during this time, that you get stronger, you get kind of heavier and stronger. So that will have a more of an issue on the bones, but obviously the bones have to wait to develop to that. So there's a kind of lag in between where the muscles get stronger and the bone density hasn't necessarily developed to the muscle strength. This is obviously a very different process for girls and boys, and happens at different times and happens in different ways. So this is something we're really looking to investigate in our dancers, and we've started doing a lot of work into that. It's also quite different from each individual. So even though we'll have some kind of general guidelines, it's always worth noting that each person is different. And just to kind of illustrate that point, you can see this group here, where this is one year 10 cohort. And you can see that the heights of the students are very different, and probably the maturation levels as well. So what we've tried to try and deal with this is we've developed a maturation flagging system where we use a combination of different predictive estimations, such as the Camus-Roche method, and we also use current anthropometric knowledge, such as change in height or average change in height across a month. This, we've developed students that are kind of yellow flag in terms of around their growth spurt, and students that are red flag where they're in their kind of peak growth spurt. And once we've got this system, we've also then created an education strategy for the students and staff. So the staff will be aware of the biological age of each student, and they will therefore maybe modify class for those that are going through the more in that red flag situation where they're in that kind of peak growth spurt. And we also teach the students, our physios prepared a kind of infographic for them in terms of where to look out for pain, just to really flag up any of those apophyseal injury risks, so they get it identified early on, so they don't let it become a more significant problem. Obviously, this is still hugely challenging. As you can see, it's very different. And also our activity is quite unique and quite different. There's not a huge amount of research within dance, even though there's some good work being done in a kind of wider sporting context. So in terms of that, we're obviously looking to do our own research. So for me, I'm doing a PhD, which is looking at the influence of the influence of adolescent maturation on injury risk and success in elite pre-professional dancers, which is obviously looking at how that affects injury risk and performance within our dancers, and looking at some of the stuff we've talked about today in a little bit more detail. And obviously what we're looking to do is get a kind of smooth transition, because obviously the dancers have to change a lot from when they come in year 7, as we can see on our left, or year 8, to when they're kind of adult dancers preparing to enter companies. On top of this, we're also doing a growth-related project with Siobhan Mitchell, who's now at Exeter University, which looks at how our dancers grow and how that's different to a general population. Again, just to understand the differences that might be unique to our population, to get the best perspective on this possible. And I'm also looking at a project which spans both the upper school and our school, just looking at our counter movement jump profiling and looking at kind of injury risk related to that. And that's alongside Daniel Cohen at the University of Santander, and George Simkin, who's at Amazon, who's a kind of machine learning specialist. So that's kind of an overview, hopefully, of a lot of the stuff we do at White Lodge. Feel free to obviously ask any questions, and I will pass you on to Matt, who will give you a little bit more about how that moves on towards the upper school with the older dancers.
Thank you very much, Niall. So before I get started on my kind of segment, I just want to briefly kind of mention the evolution of research at the Royal Ballet School, and specifically the upper school. So when I was employed by the school, half of my role was spent delivery, so 18 hours a week and strength conditioning wise, and the other half was employed as kind of research practitioner, and specifically I was studying for a master's in research. And so my 18 hours a week supplemented that of other sports scientists already employed by the school, Adam Matusi, and the other half was specifically to identify and be able to quantify our training loads at the school. So that was an area that the Royal Ballet School definitely wanted to enhance its knowledge on. So kind of one of the first things I obviously had to do, like in most other environments, was just develop a context of what ballet is and what it looks like. And hopefully I'm going to share some of that with you now. So within ballet, there's a high rate of injury. So research would kind of dictate about 3/4 of students in a kind of pre-professional setting developed an injury within an academic year, and kind of similar numbers are seen within kind of professional companies. However, there's a little bit more of a varied distribution. So some research will pull out numbers around 60%, others slightly higher, around kind of 80-85%. But of those kind of high injury rates, there's a very high prevalence of overuse injuries. Again, in a kind of pre-professional setting, that's about 3/4, about 75% of all injuries received over academic years, like multiple academic years, were kind of overuse in nature compared to traumatic. And slightly higher numbers are seen in kind of professional companies, both in ballet and also like contemporary dance, with kind of over 4/5 of the injuries being overuse in nature. Novelly at school, kind of in the earlier years, as the team was being developed, we had numbers around the kind of 60%, 70%. But fortunately, our kind of overuse numbers definitely haven't been as high as some of what the researchers said, and year on year they've dropped. They still account for majority, but our overuse injury risk rate is about kind of just over 50%. Ballet itself is kind of the intensity is dictated in a sense by the choreography, and some professional companies where they're rehearsing and different pieces for shows, where it's the actual rehearsing of that performance or the performance itself. Those physical demands are going to be dictated on the different types of performances, where it's like kind of very classical, or it's very physical, more kind of contemporary ballet. In a pre-professional setting, in the school setting, a large majority of the training is going to be spent for towards technical development. That's also going to kind of dictate intensity. But typically ballet classes are very intermittent. There's kind of short, moderate to high intensity bursts, but they're always interspersed with a longer, low intensity, typically the aerobic training, but sometimes even less than, kind of even lower intensities. Some of the research that had already been conducted kind of pulled out some key numbers. So less than 15% of the training was, or about 15% of the training was kind of vigorous to very vigorous activity. From a perceived intensity, around 26 sessions, or 26% of sessions was kind of self-reported by the dancers as being high intensity, with the majority being moderate or low intensity. And research from Jeffries, Wallace and Coutts found that around just under 80% of the training was done at less than 70% heart rate max. So there's higher number of injuries, a lot of those overuse, but then the intensity would dictate that it's not that intense and compared to other sports or other artistic environments. So we kind of had to start looking elsewhere, like why are these injuries so high? And one of the things we found was there's a higher workload reported and associated with dance. So that same research by Jeffries, Wallace and Coutts, but also Alexi and Coutts found that there's a high workload in ballet. So about 480 ultra units reported in a single dance session, compared to around 250 to up to 500 ultra units in an equivalent football setting. So that was female dancers compared to female football players. And then within that, we also kind of understand that there's a higher jump workload in ballet. It's a big thing. Kind of research has suggested that the higher forces in jumping, whether it's in the kind of landing phase itself or associated with the high kind of takeoff forces, are equal to, or there's a correlation with higher injury rates. So bigger jumps lead to a higher rate of injury, which kind of makes sense. But in the ground reaction forces themselves and jumps vary quite a lot. So smaller double leg jumps can see ground reaction forces up to 3 times body weight, but bigger and more explosive double leg jumps or single leg jumps where there's rotations involved can see ground reaction forces up to 10 or kind of definitely 9.5 times body weight. Other kind of research in a professional male setting and professional company, but specifically looking at male dancers, found that within performances, there's an average of 7 jumps per minute. So performance lasts for like up to from 2 hours up to 3 hours with different acts. There's going to be a higher number of jumps performed in those performances themselves, but also an even greater number in all the rehearsals leading up to that. Novelly at the school, when I started my MROs, we started looking at quantifying jump volumes within the pre-professional setting, but also looking at kind of internal heart rate response as well. One of the things we found was that every day there's a ballet class, and the kind of classes, I'll touch on the breakdown of what a class looks like a little bit later on, but within the kind of last 10 to 30 minutes, depending on what type of class it is, there's a jumping section. And within that jumping portion, just in a single day in a single class, there's a high number of jumps. And we found that there's between 150 up to 300 plus jumps within the kind of that short time period. And there's, because of the nature of jumps, or it's double legs or single legs, or there's these small plyometric foot contacts, which created to over 300 per session. And that was just the first class of the day. They may have 1 or 2 other more classes, and I might have rehearsals later on. So just almost in the kind of that warm-up class of the day, they're exposed to a high number of jumps. And so from that, we can understood why there was a higher rate of injury within ballet, and we decided that what we need to do is be able to quantify our training load within the school, so what a day looked like, what a week looked like, and what our kind of year or our academic terms looked like. And one of the things we found was that there wasn't really that much variation in terms of training load. So we have our male dancers and our female dancers kind of right and left respectively, and we have our 3 kind of set terms. So we've got September to December, January to March, and then April, end of April, May, up to July. And because we're a school environment, we work towards academic terms, but we found that there was some variation in terms of training load, but the variation was still between a high training load just to a very high training load. There wasn't that much tapering. We kind of periodize, or the lower weekly training loads you'd see would be in a kind of approach or an attempt to periodize training at the start of the term. And as a result of this kind of lack of variation, there's very high strain values and high training monotony associated with that. So in terms of our female dancers, the highest weekly training load we saw was like 8,000 arbitrary units, and for the males, it's about 7,000 arbitrary units. And there'll be different reasons why that slightly higher might be perceived intensity, or might be the time spent performing for female dancers slightly greater than for the male dancers. So in terms of my masters, there's that kind of 2 sides. There's be able to quantify what a year looked like, and then breaking that down into a week. And so what we found was that our 3rd years, our kind of graduate years, as kind of Wayne had said, were preparing for potential jobs or auditions or performances for companies. They had the highest training loads associated with their training weeks. And again, that could have been they were just spending more time dancing because they had rehearsals in the evening, as well as all their school classes in the day, or the intensity of their classes and their rehearsals were just higher because they were having to learn more demanding repertoire. Our first years and our second years were kind of closely slightly related, but first year was generally kind of the easier year, and the second year was a little bit harder, and the third year has been even more intense. And we found that there's differences across the week as well. So because we are a school environment and there's a big technical component, our longest classes were on Monday and Tuesday, which is where we kind of see the highest training loads. So a ballet class on a Monday and Tuesday might be 2 hours long. It gets slightly shorter by Wednesday and Thursday, kind of varies between like 90 minutes and 2 hours. And on Friday or Saturday classes, a lot shorter. So the shortest class would be 60 minutes, but again, would vary between 60 and 90 minutes, depending on what week of the year we're in and kind of what we're working towards. But ultimately, we kind of found out that, especially at the upper school, the 3 clearly defined training groups all had different training loads, and as a result would have different demands placed on them. Obviously, I don't know how much knowledge of a ballet studio there is, but a ballet studio is inside, it's nice and warm, but there'll be these bars that run along the edge of the studio. So we're on all 4 sides of the room. And in terms of a ballet class, a technical ballet class, the start of the class, about the first 45 to an hour of the class the students will be stood around the bar, just working on specific movements. And then kind of the last half, or the last, definitely a third of the class will be spent in the middle of the studio. So that's doing center exercises such as this, or doing more jump related exercises. But what we found from a heart rate and internal response point of view is that this first section bar started off nice and gentle and was in essence a warm-up. So the movement started nice and small and gradually got bigger and bigger. And then when they kind of moved into this middle of the studio, whether it's from the center point of view or from the jumping point of view, the allegro portion, it got a little bit more intense, a little bit more demanding. In this class, the first half an hour was at the bar, and what you'd see if you had an accelerometer or GPS monitor on a dancer, there wouldn't be that much movement in this first half an hour. Physically, they're still working very tough. Whereas one of our first realizations as well is that if we had an accelerometer on the students, it wouldn't look like they're working for the first portion of the class, but internally they are working very hard because the movements get slightly ever so slightly greater and more demanding And so what you'd see is the exercises in this bar would start nice and small, where it's kind of small movements around the hip or the leg, and then gradually get more explosive and bigger ranges of motion seen, which would kind of account for this higher heart rate. And in the exercises, they kind of ended the bar with, they'd almost start at the center. And so they'd come away from the bar, they'd be moving a little bit more and traveling. A kind of typical student group size in our school is about 15 dancers. And so in the bar, you can get all 15 students working the same way. But then when you come to the center for the center portion or the jumping portion, you can't get all 15 students traveling around. It's just pure chaos. And so they kind of separate off into groups. And so we'd have these more prolonged work periods of around kind of 3 to 4 minutes. And then there'd be these kind of drop off, these rests. So it might be that they're resting or stood at the side of the class while another group's going. Or because we are still at school and it's still an emphasis on technical development, the portions, the breaks might be the teachers setting an exercise or giving feedback. So the heart rate response kind of very much matched up with what we knew about the intensity of ballet, in the sense that it's very intermittent. We might have these short periods of high intense workloads, but ultimately it kind of drops off very quickly. It's very intermittent. This class example is a kind of 17-year-old female dancer, and about a quarter of the class, about 26%, was spent working at kind of less than 50% of their heart rate, maximal heart rate. Just over a third, or about a third, about 33%, was spent working between 50 to 60%. And that kind of final third was a little bit more varied, in the sense that there was working between like 60 to 90%. So within this class, this dancer kind of didn't go up into over 90% of the heart rate, which again kind of fits in with what we understood about a kind of a ballet class setting. It was intermittent, it was kind of medium to high intensity, but never really got very high. Kind of when we had developed this picture of what training loads looked like at the school, one of the first things we identified was we just needed to cut the training hours across the board. And as a result, that meant we was kind of losing some time in terms of physical development. So we had less time for Pilates and strength and conditioning. But that kind of first year where we started to reduce our training volume, and ever since we've seen like a progressive decrease in the total number of injuries, kind of got less severe injuries. And so there's less days restricted and there's less days off dance altogether. But in terms of the upper school and their physical development, the third years, our graduate year, get half an hour of Pilates a week, and our kind of first and second years, our development years, get an hour of Pilates a week. In terms of strength and condition, everyone, or every kind of subgroup, every training group, gets at least 45 minutes in a group session a week, and there'll be individual sessions around that. But our third year males and our first year males get an hour and a half of S&C a week. And that's because for our first year males, there's a higher, because they start to do pas de deux, where this, as Ray mentioned, dancing with both the male and female parts. There's some physical work for the guys. They need to be strong from an upper body point of view. So for the first year males, we have an extra S&C session to help build them up. And for our third years, we kind of got a similar thing, but on the other end of the continuum, they're still doing pas de deux work, but it's a little bit more complex. They'll be doing more single arm upper body presses, or having to do more holds. And so again, they need to be strong from an upper body point of view, but the demands are slightly different. As a result, their training sessions are slightly different. But in terms of their S&C development at the upper school and Royal Ballet School, we profile 3 times a year, so at the start of each academic term. From a physio perspective, there'll be like a range of motion tests around the big toe, ankle dorsiflexion, around the hip explicitly, internal and external rotation. Both Niall and Wayne have already mentioned how like turnout's a big factor. All the students also have like a thoracic rotation symmetry test, and the younger years will have a scoliosis test. Sports science wise, we do bilateral and unilateral jumps on the force platform. We also do single leg isometric tests, so specifically looking at the plantar flexion, but also single leg squat. We look at trunk capacity, and for our older years, so for the upper school years, we also look at overhead press capacity. And so from all those tests, from the profiling, myself and Niall will start to analyze the data, and then at the upper school, we split the students into 3 groups. So in the first years, we'll tend to have kind of a movement development group. These will be dancers who would be international students or would have come from schools outside of the Royal Ballet School setting. So the students who will come from White Lodge have already spent a number of years working with Niall already from the physical development point of view. And so they are kind of competent, robust, they're good movers. Whereas what we tend to see is the dancers who come from international schools or outside their setting tend to be amazing in terms of their technical moves, but just lack basic kind of normal fundamental movement skills. And so that kind of movement development group or fundamental movement skills development group tends to primarily be in the first years and just get everyone working on kind of a similar level. In our second and third years, we tend to split off between if they're velocity dominant, so got very good jump related scores, then they might tend to work a little bit more on their rated force development. If they're very strong in terms of their isometric tests, but quite poor in terms of their either double leg jumping or single leg jumping tests, then there might be more in this velocity development or kind of power development group. But ultimately, every time we profile these groups will get mixed up. But typically an S&C structure at the upper school will have this kind of movement preparation, this kind of warm-up period. Again, everything we do, it depends on where we are. So if we're in September, October time, where there's a higher emphasis on technical development, our sessions might be around just kind of basic conditioning or basic movements, getting them strong for that. But when we're in the summer term, so April, May, June, then we're preparing for summer shows. The outcome of our sessions might be dictated on what they do. So as Wayne already said, we've got about 85 dancers at the upper school, and in terms of performances, not all dancers were doing the same exercise, same performances. Sorry, so we might have a couple dancers who are across multiple performances that have to develop different things. We might have half of our second years all working in a part of their performance, so all kind of need the same thing. But others might need more single leg jumping or kind of more conditioning focused. So as I said, depending on where we are in the season dictates on what we do. Our kind of main chunk of the session will be working in this kind of strength groups or this fundamental movements groups or power development groups, where we'll have like kind of 3 to 5 key exercises kind of pertinent to that training group. But then we'll also have like 2 to 3 accessory exercises, whether it's trunk development, proprioceptive development, unilateral work. One of the big things we see is because dancers spend so much time on a single leg, there's naturally an asymmetry balance there. So this could be an opportunity to readdress that. And then the last portion of our session is these individual development exercises or kind of prevention exercises. So there'll be like kind of 2 to 3 isolated exercises. These will fundamentally be kind of dancer-led in a sense that each dancer will have 1 or 2 focal points to work on. So these focal points could be kind of trunk strength or capacity. It might be hip, knee, turnout focused, foot and ankle conditioning focused, posterior chain, jumping or rate or force development focused. It could be landing or neuromuscular control focused. Some of the guys might have targeted flexibility work, or it could just be top-up conditioning, depending on what they need. And those 9 points will be kind of identified or curated from profiling deficits ultimately. So if there's a big gap missing from their profiling scores, that this will be the time they can work on that. It could be previous injuries or kind of common injuries. So for a 16-year-old female dancer coming into the upper school, the Royal Ballet School, they suddenly spend a lot of time on point. So rising up onto these kind of wooden blocks. And so foot and ankle injuries are highest in our first year ladies and the rest of the school. And so this could be a time where we focus on, or kind of preemptively try to focus on that, developing good foot and ankle strength or endurance here. It could be, these groups could be also focused on either artistic feedback, so feedback from the teachers saying X dancer needs to work on this, but also is dancer focused in the sense that we've developed a good culture where the dancer's going to say, I'm preparing for this, or I want to be better at this, can I work on that? And so this kind of last kind of 10-15 minutes of the session is be where the dancer has a little bit of autonomy over what they do. But that was kind of a very quick and definite description. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much on what strength and conditioning looks like in the upper school, kind of what the physical demands of ballet are and how we can, in a way, dictate that or respond to that. But thank you very much for listening to Wayne, Niall and myself, and we hope you enjoyed it.